Operation Gladio meets secret societies with War Hamster Brady. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Looking forward to it as always.
This is going to be a little different, but the same.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it. We're going to tell the story of the Carnegies, and it's different than some of the stories we've told before because there really is no connection directly to secret societies. But bear with us because we're going to loop it back into secret societies, Skull and Bones, and Operation Gladio when we get to the end. But the story of Andrew Carnegie is worth telling on its own. And because it kind of connects some themes we've been going over, but it's also going to set the stage for some new themes. At some point in the not too distant future, we're going to spend several episodes going into foundations and how they influence the world in ways never intended. So we're going to touch on that a little bit today, but that's one of the major themes we're going to be getting here. But let us start with Mr. Andrew Carnegie. He is born in 1835 in a place called Dunfermline, Scotland, in a weaver's cottage. And that means his parents were poor. They basically shared a room and one living room for like 2 or 3 families. And that was the family business, was weaving. The family falls on hard times. His dad borrows money from a guy by the name of George Lauder Sr. to move to the United States in 1848. Lauder's son, George Jr., would come to America and would all go on and partner with Carnegie in later businesses. So this is an important transaction. Funny side note about I'll get to that later. So the family moves to Allegheny, Pennsylvania. Father's trying to sell his own weaving products, not going very well. Dad's not much of a breadwinner. But Andrew's a really bright lad. The two of them both get jobs when he's 12 years old at a place called the Anchor Cotton Mills. This is the child labor of the 1800s that we know and love so well. And Carnegie's a product of that, which is important. So let's see. Andrew Carnegie works as what's called a bobbin boy, and he's working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and he's making $1.20 a week. His dad quits and ends up kind of riding off into the sunset. Wasn't much of a family man after that. Andrew moves up, gets a job with a guy by the name of John Harr, doing similar things at $2 a week. That's worth about $73 a week today is what he's making, supporting the family. I guess mom works a little bit too. 1849, he becomes a telegraph messenger boy at $2.50 a week. Now, what's funny about when you talk about Andrew Carnegie, the history of him, is what you're going to see is Andrew Carnegie never had a son, and he cares an awful lot about his legacy. And that's why you see the name stamped all over museums and libraries around the country. But he also wrote autobiographies and had several biographies written about him, and a lot of the stories make him seem like this really noble guy. Okay, all about philanthropy. And his actions may not match that, so I'll let you guys decide when we get to the end here what kind of guy he really was. But a lot of the stories you hear about him are really papered over. Fair enough?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I just want to set that thing earlier because there's the myth and then there's the truth when it comes to Carnegie. And, it's the truth. Well, we'll let you decide the truth.
Yeah, the myth is much bigger than the...
Yeah, actual. And he spent a lot of his resources working on that image.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's a really sharp kid. He learns how to decode telegraphs just from listening it by ear. He memorized, as he's running around Pittsburgh, he knew all the businesses, all the important men. So this is a teenager. He's hustling, and he's really sharp. He spends a lot of time. This guy named Colonel James Anderson opened up his library of like 400 volumes to kids, of the public, and Carnegie was there all the time. So he's precocious. So in 1853, at the age of 18, he makes it to the big time, gets a job as a telegraph operator for the Pennsylvania Railroad.
Ooh.
Anybody play Monopoly? Same Pennsylvania Railroad. There's a reason for that they used the Pennsylvania Railroad on Monopoly, because Monopoly was about the robber baron's Gilded Age. That's why the banker in Monopoly is J.P. Morgan. That's who was founded after. And they used Carnegie's, the place he worked was Pennsylvania Railroad. So this all ties to monopoly.
And the telegraph back in the day was the way you spy on everything.
Yeah, and it's also another theme. These families, these cartels that they form, they're always trying to capture the means of communication or transportation. That's
both and or.
Yeah, and sometimes they're the same. And every new technology, these are the people financing it, getting there first, and making billions off it. And quite often, these new technologies are built with what they call federally funded public improvements. And this ties into a big theme. I've talked about Hamilton and how he wanted the American system with protective tariffs, federally funded internal improvements. That's basically code word for crony capitalism or mercantilism. And you see this American system sounds so fine and dandy, and he built the greatest economy in the United States, but it also created this wealth disparity where these families and a generational wealth control all of the institutions and the government itself. So is that really a great system, or do we just create the greatest system of oligarchy of all time?
I'm going for the latter, but
what's that?
I vote on the latter, but go ahead.
Yeah, I do too. And, but I do understand the argument for the American system, because if you compare it to the international system they were competing against, it's better. But to me, it's just an Americanized version of the mercantilist system we fought a Revolutionary War to get away from.
Yeah.
And when you're using federal tax dollars for your internal improvements, in the Hamilton's day, that was in Hamilton's day, internal improvements were like building canals for the steamships. So companies like who did we do last week? The Whitneys could build their steamship fortune on the backs of the taxpayer. Yeah. Well, in Lincoln's day, which led into the robber baron, the Gilded Age, that was the railroads. And the government's basically financing a lot of the transcontinental railroads and other railroads. States are doing other railroad projects. And these private kings of capitalism are using, they're taking advantage of that, creating their own monopolies and cartels, knocking out the competition over and over and over again. You see that story with whether it be the Rockefellers to Carnegie to all of the robber barons. That's why they called them robber barons. And that's how they made their money. All right, getting back into Andrew Carnegie. He's a telegraph operator for the Pennsylvania Railroad. 6 years later, at 24, he becomes the superintendent of Western Division of Railroad. And he would hire his younger brother, Tom, as his personal secretary. Tom's part of the story. He had a lot of business ventures with Andrew. A very wealthy man on his own. At this point in time, he's making $1,500 a year at the age of 24. That's a lot of money back then. And it's because that guy, John Hay, really took a liking to him. He learns the railroad business. The owner of the railroad is a guy by the name of Thomas Scott. And he and Scott would be friends and business partners for a long, long time. Thomas Scott probably mentored him a bit and helps him with his first investments. Carnegie was able to get into a lot of deals because of Scott's private contacts. He'd make an introduction and he could get in, you could get in on deals early. A lot of those investments were pretty scandalous. They had inside information. They were doing insider trading, using quid pro quo contracting scandals. Same stuff's going on today. Remember the image of this business titan with great ethics, right? So I'm suggesting maybe not so much with his investments. There's insider relationships allowed to invest in something called the Adams Express Company. That was interesting because it was a $500 investment that was secured by his mom mortgaged to a $600 mortgage on their $700 house to get this investment into the Adams Express Company. But that was important because now that's getting him into other railroad-related industries, and he's building up a capital base that's diversified and everything to do with the railroad. Big one was he gets involved with the Pullman rail car company. Those are the sleeping class cars for first class travel. It was a new thing in the 1870s, and he is an early investor. During the Civil War, his former boss, Thomas Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad, was named the Assistant Secretary of War in charge of military transportation. So Carnegie gets involved because Scott's his mentor. And Carnegie personally opened the rail lines into Washington, D.C. and rode the first train carrying the troops into D.C. It's kind of a big deal. And it's funny because Carnegie's only 5'3", but he carried a really big persona. So him riding at the front of this train in front of all these soldiers, it's a comical photo. I didn't track it down, but it's there. He also personally supervised the transport of the defeated Union troops after losing the Battle of Bull Run. Never fought, but he did help with the logistics. And the trains and logistics of the Union and the North was a big part of the reason why the North won that war. You've seen the Civil War films. You always see the Union blue on the railroads. Carnegie's a big part of that. 1864, he's an early investor into something called the Columbia Oil Company in Pennsylvania, and that made a lot of money. Then he, at the time, iron and steel demand is just rising like you wouldn't believe. The Civil War's over. America is booming. There's demand for steel. We're building railroads everywhere. Carnegie gets involved with a huge iron and steel company and establishes with some of his business partners. He always had the same group of people around him. Established a steel rolling mill, and he decides, I'm getting out of the railroad business and I'm just going to focus on ironworks. That's why he became the godfather of American steel. Used the connections of Thomas Scott and one of Scott's partners, J. Edgar Thompson. He would name a steel plant after Thompson. Use their connections to acquire contracts for things like building bridges, the Keystone Bridge Company. So you got all these insider deals. Big contracts coming down, and Carnegie would get the full contract, and he'd undercut the prices of his competitors. What else does he do? He gave Scott shares in his company, and Pennsylvania Railroad became his best customer. So it's interesting how that works. A little self-dealing by Scott. This sounding familiar?
Yeah, a lot.
So he's famous for, there's a letter he wrote in 1868 at age 33. Where he basically states, and he's writing this to himself, he goes, I believe in using fortune for others and doing more than making money. And the direct quote from his letter to himself was, I propose to take an income no greater than $50,000 per annum. Beyond this, I need ever earn or make no effort to increase my fortune, but spend the surplus each year for benevolent purposes. Let us cast aside business forever except for others. Pretty lofty ideals, wouldn't you say?
It sounds good.
Did he live up to them?
No.
He didn't stop at $50,000 a year, did he?
No.
In fact, he would not really get into philosophy for another 35, 40 years. And there's a reason for that. And you'll see the people that, some of his heirs, when you see them interviewed, tell the story of Andrew Carnegie, they always go back to this letter where he was always this benevolent guy. Well, yeah, but he didn't do that. Okay. He had spent some time after the Civil War selling European and American bonds. He sort of sold over 30 million bonds over 5 years, but he says, I'm tired of trading paper. I want to build real things. That's when he really, really takes off in the steel industry. So it's like 1875 to 1900, he built his empire. All kinds of innovations, from mass production, which is the Bessemer process. That lowers steel prices and really cuts out the competition. He was big into vertical integration. He would buy not only the ore mines, both horizontal and vertical integration he was doing. He owned every aspect of the production. By the 1880s, he's the largest manufacturer of pig iron, steel, and coke in the world. See a couple of benchmarks. 1889, U.S. steel output surpassed the United Kingdom. The British had always had the head start on industrialization on the rest of the world because of the dual entry banking system, the joint stock company system they set up. Well, U.S. caught up. Empire keeps growing. Includes steelworks, furnaces throughout Pennsylvania. Then he combines all of his assets and those of his associates in 1892 to launch the Carnegie Steel Company, this one big conglomerate. Now, here you got the steel and the railroad barons working closely to negotiate prices instead of allowing free market competition. Why is that a problem? Well, you can't compete.
Right.
And it's not fair. It's insider, it's crony dealing. And remember, this is the guy who talks about how charitable he is when he was 38 years old. He also had a huge leg up because of U.S. trade tariffs. He would constantly lobby Congress to continue the trade tariffs. These are what you call protective tariffs. It protects you from competition. And historians now say that they were making $1 million a year on these tariffs. Carnegie was. And it's something Carnegie always tried to hide. He didn't want to admit that. One of the things he believed in, he said, was his people, and one of his famous quotes is, "You could take all my plants and all my money, and in 4 years I could rebuild Carnegie just with my people." So was he really all about the people? Well, we've all seen the movies and read the books about the backbreaking labor at these steel mills during the entire robber baron era. Really low wages. People would lose hands and legs. They had no health care, child labor. All that stuff's going on. And Carnegie and his partner Frick, and Frick's a big part of his story, they knew how bad the working conditions were, but they only cared about cutting costs. Which brings us to the Homestead strike. You remember that from school?
No.
It's a big labor strike. The union was the Allegheny.
I read about the one that was in Colorado, but that was the aluminum one.
Yeah, well, this is the steel strike, and it's a big one. The labor contract's up in 1892. Carnegie at the time is in Scotland, visiting his homestead, basically donating his first library. And I'll talk about his personal life. He's with his wife at the time, and finally married, but we'll get to that. So he's in Scotland, and Frick is running the company. Carnegie had left orders with Frick to break the union, and he said, in writing, "Use any methods you need to break the union. We will back you." So Frick, when he knows the strike's coming, where the union contract's coming up, surrounds the whole plant at Homestead, Pennsylvania, with barbed wire fence and shuts the plant down. Carnegie, in his writings earlier, had always said that he's really pro-labor and anti-scab. Don't take the strikers' jobs. Of course, in practice, he does the opposite. Again, that's the Carnegie controversy here, yeah. So you got all these angry, striking steel workers surrounding the plant that's got barbed wire fence. Frick, on Carnegie's behalf, hires 300 security guards known as Pinkerton Guards. Okay, go ahead.
They're just one of the original kind of big clubs that all of these industrialists used to do their bully work.
Exactly. And that's who Frick hires to break the union. But it gets interesting. They can't really get to the plant because there's so many steel workers there. They're outnumbered. There's 300 guards. So they take a ferry boat down the river, and they're trying to stop at the dock of the plant. Unfortunately, the boats are spotted, and the angry mob meets them at the dock. Gunshots are fired. One striker is shot, and now people are furious. After about 8 hours of this, the guards find themselves on a barge that's burning, and they plead for safe passage. Get us out of here. Not a pretty situation. It doesn't work well. They're trying to run the gauntlet as they're guiding them towards, I guess, the police department. 3 of the Pinkerton guards get killed running the gauntlet, and almost every one of them was injured. And that's the Pinkerton mob thing. And this whole area, it just puts this huge cloud over Homestead as this strike is trying to get settled. Terror, fear in the streets. Nobody knows what's going on. Company spies are everywhere. Some of the workers are breaking ranks to get their jobs back. And, well, what happens is basically they end up getting a new labor deal with much cheaper labor costs. So it's all worth it for the Carnegie Steel Company. And they're able to lower their costs again and make more money. Carnegie returns after all this happens, and he's not happy with Frick, even though he'd given him permission to do this. And he said he'd never trust Frick again. Carnegie actually felt guilty, or so the story goes. The problem with this is Carnegie's public image, that he's done so much to develop, going back and forth to New York and everything like that in high society, is completely tarnished because of his people hired Pinkerton guards and they killed striking workers, which is not popular. He's becoming the butt of jokes and cartoons, and he is not happy. So Carnegie would then, basically, that would be the impetus for him spending the rest of his life trying to recreate his image as this benevolent, wealthy guy who gave away all his fortunes. That sound like a pretty good motivation? Justify it?
Yeah.
He's always ferocious about cutting costs. It's a funny story. A guy by the name of Charles M. Schwab, no relation to the Charles Schwab of the investment firm. One of his partners, and he built a $3 million blast furnace. It's a lot of money back then. And he tells Carnegie, asks Schwab, how do you like it? He goes, well, it's good, but if I had known what I know now, I would have built it differently. And I could have saved 1/10 of 1 penny on every ton of steel. So the way the story goes is Andrew calculates this in his head and says, you know what, tear it down and build it right. Because I'll make that 1/10 of 1 cent would have made a difference, apparently. This is one of those things that's more myth, I think, than truth. We're in the 1880s. He's building huge U.S. monuments. We're getting ready to have a standing army that needs to be equipped and outfitted. We've got the Navy building the Whitney's new battleships and steamships. Well, they need the steel, and Carnegie's making money hand over fist. It's making about $20 million a year in profit, which is a lot of money back then. So we get to 1901. We'll get to his personal life. I'm going to come back to this, okay?
Okay.
So he's 65 years old, and he's considering retirement. One of the things he wrote was you spend the first third of your life learning, second third of your life building up wealth, and the last third of your life giving it all away. That's what he thinks it is to be a noble man. So his former partner, Henry Clay Frick, gets together with Charles Schwab and banker J.P. Morgan to purchase the entire Carnegie company. This would become U.S. Steel, the first modern U.S. corporation and also the first American billion-dollar company. Kind of a big deal. Carnegie's share, the purchase price was $303 million. Carnegie's share is $225 million of that. It's probably around $7 or $8 billion today. He gets paid a lot of that in 5% 50-year gold bonds. So it had to be a purchase that big. No one had the money, so they had to finance it over 50 years. So he decides he is out of the steel business, and he's going to dedicate the rest of his life to becoming a scholar and an activist and a philanthropist. And his goal is to give away all of his money. Famous quote from Carnegie: "A rich man who dies rich dies a disgrace." Of course, you also got to remember, he has no sons to pass on his wealth on. He did have a daughter, which we'll get to. But he has he's not going to have a legacy, mankind's search for immortality. So he's going to leave his name on all these buildings instead, under the guise of charitable philanthropy.
But isn't that the same model that all of them use now? They set up these trusts as if they're giving their money away, when really, for all practical purposes, it's a tax dodge.
Yeah, it really is. I'm a big fan of building, anybody building wealth and being able to pass it down to your heirs, building something for a legacy like that. What I'm not a fan of is doing that with tax breaks. And worse is the people that made their money given tax dollars, but then they tax breaks, while the rest of us get the income tax in 1913. Coincidentally, 3 years after the first two of those charitable foundations were formed, none other than the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. So
Okay.
that's the big bait and switch they did from 1910 to 1913, while their bankers are creating the Federal Reserve. And they're
Correct.
passing the 16th and 17th Amendments and basically stole America.
Yeah.
Um, and they just don't pay tax. They pay almost no taxes.
Yeah, but they have what they bought with all of that is this disguise of philanthropy.
Yeah, and
So they're actually very evil people dressed up as kind of a Borg kind of creation where behind the mask they're evil, and in front of the mask they pretend themselves to be these benevolent people giving away all of their money.
look at me, I'm so magnanimous. Yeah, it's exactly right. But it goes even further than that. This whole philanthropy racket, and maybe it's under the guise of charity and they do some goods. But if you really track all the money, what happens is all these rich people go to these philanthropic dinners, and that's where you rub elbows, and that's how you raise yourself in society, which is very important in New York at the Gilded Age. You know, this group called the 400. It was a list by Mrs. Astor created, and we'll get into that when we talk about the Vanderbilts a bit, which is coming soon. But yeah, it's exactly right. But so it's not just philanthropy; it's about a social climbing. It's where a lot of these backroom business deals are done, and as we've shown, some of these backroom business deals are also about who we're going to put in Congress or the presidency, and why we want to do that to help our multinational, business ventures, which takes us 50 years later right into Gladio.
Yeah.
So, and this is how it's done. Yeah, that's right, Renee. Champagne socialists. There's a few other good names for them too. Limousine liberals now. All right. One of his things that he always talked about is he was opposed to war. He was also very much opposed to the American colonies. He did not want us to colonize the Philippines or that right after the War of 1898. He actually tried to arrange for the independence of the Philippines, tried to give them money so they could do it. That's why he's been a Republican to support his whole life. All these Northeast industrialists and robber barons, they are Republicans. They are the ones who financed Lincoln's campaign and benefited from the Union winning the war. The Northeast industrialists are Republican through and through. But he, in 1898, because he's apparently so dedicated now to peace, supports William Jennings Bryan against McKinley, who was the Republican president. He would join something called the American Anti-Imperialist League, and none of the people who were in that were former presidents Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison and author Mark Twain. So they're really against American expansionism, something I actually agree with. All right, so that sets the tone. So let's talk about his family a little bit. We don't see any Carnegies anymore, right? The names, nobody has that last name.
Right.
What happened was his mom had made him promise never to marry while she was alive. In
That's a
1880,
little weird.
yeah,
That kind of gives a new definition to a mama's boy, don't it?
it does.
Wow.
Yeah. He'd taken his mom over to Scotland, and she had a pretty good life once he made it. But yeah, so she passes away in 1883. He had his brother Tom also passed away that same year. He had been dating in the New York social scene since about 1880, and he met a woman named Louise Whitfield, who he dated more than anyone else. He would finally marry her in 1886, where 51-year-old Andrew Carnegie would marry 29-year-old Louise. They were described as a perfect match. She shared his belief that money should not be left to family. So this is the time period where the Fabian socialists are basically starting to infiltrate the eastern seaboard with their ideas. We've got the dollar princesses marrying the European nobility and vice versa. This is the social scene. She's one of the socialites, and they've got all these wonderful progressive ideas. And here we have old Andrew Carnegie trying to save his reputation, so he's going out there and spending lavishly and becoming a socialite so he can be seen with rubbing elbows with the best people. I'm just picturing the movie, the series on HBO, The Gilded Age, and it just makes so perfect. They did it so well. Okay, they have one daughter, Margaret. Um, World War II would break him because of his love for peace, apparently, and he dies in 1919. He left his wife, her personal assets, a small cash gift, and their Manhattan townhouse, plus the holiday home in Scotland called Skibo Castle. And I've got to pull up a picture of that real quick. So give me 1 second.
I'm sure it's a hovel.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I can't find it real quick. So you want to kill some dead air for about a minute. I got to pull up the picture.
Okay. So I wanted to kind of bring people along as we get into the late 1800s, early 1900s. The Carnegie Foundation for International Peace, or Institute of International Peace, isn't the only legacy of Carnegie. He had many. There was a science foundation, there was an educational foundation. It is almost like a shadow apparatus that mirrors, in many cases, the Rockefellers, but it operated in the shadow. It's almost as if the Rockefellers was out front, but the Carnegie legacy of all of these different institutes that he set up were operating behind the scenes. And I'll go into a couple of those because I came across the education one when I was working with our local school board, developing presentations and material, and for a group that met here in Polk County, Moms for Liberty, on the taking over of the social emotional learning of our education process. And I found the Carnegie Institute for Education to be one of those bedrock things around the early 1900s.
Yeah, and that's social emotional learning. That is part of how wokeness gets introduced. I mean, that's really at the heart of it, and it comes from these type of institutions.
Yep.
As we say, these are the people that shape all of our institutions and our culture. And it starts at the universities, goes all the way through all these NGOs, different organizations, philanthropies, etc. And it's an entire network, and it's going to be very hard for us to dismantle, although it's definitely necessary.
Did you find it?
Yeah, I did. Here we go.
It should pop up.
I've got it 1 second. It just takes me a second. And all these different softwares. Yeah, this is their little cottage in Scotland.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, that's a small cottage.
Yeah. This guy's very, very. Yeah, he wants to give away all his wealth, but he leaves this for his wife. So that's pretty nice. And I think that's Skibidoo, whatever it's called, castle is still there to this day.
Well, you'd have to have an entire endowment just to maintain that monstrosity.
Well, funny you would say that, because we'll get to that in a second here.
I know how that works.
So his daughter Margaret. No, what's funny is him and his wife had a prenuptial agreement, one of the very first ones in America to actually do this. So she knew she wasn't getting his millions and millions, what would have been billions today. Margaret gets a small trust, but they end up having to sell off the townhome due to costly upkeep, as the Colonel just mentioned.
Yeah.
Margaret would marry, different last name, so that's why we don't have any Carnegies. She'd have 4 children. We've now got about 13 fourth-generation Carnegie lineage and about 50 current direct descendants. None of them have the Carnegie name. None of them were Skull and Bones. But the family, all these heirs, they've remained involved in philanthropy of some way, shape, or form, which is they get a stipend from it. They have the Carnegie name, which gives any kind of charitable organization or event prestige. So these guys get invited. They get paid for these little appearances, and that's how they've got a little bit of a stipend. But these people, all these heirs, they weren't given the big silver spoon. They didn't pass the money down like the Whitneys and other families did. So it's interesting. The family, if you listen to any of the family members interviewed, they always talk about, well, the heritage is more important than wealth. Well, I guess if you only have one of the two, you're going to like it.
You might well make the best of it.
Funny story, about 2.5 acres of land that I grew up on up in Oregon had horses. And when the family was going to move to San Diego, we sold it to a trust that paid for it in cash. And those were the Carnegies, who were real big into the equestrian sports, which was a good location for it. I never met them, but apparently they still own the property to this day.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, I went and looked at it on Google Maps. It changed it a little bit. Okay, a little bit more about the Carnegie family. His brother Thomas had died, and he bestowed his fortune a little differently. And he was rich too, not as rich as his brother, but he divided it up, his multi-million-dollar fortune, between his wife and 9 children. Each of these children would receive a trust fund of about $10 million, and that is a lot of money back then. This side of the Carnegie family would go on to build a bunch of houses, little cottages, on an island called, in Georgia, which is called Cumberland Island. And that's still there. Yeah, you know it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can visit it. But they still own it, and they still have their family holidays there. But let's just take a look at some of
take a ferry around it.
Yeah. So let's just take a look at that island. All right, let's see one of the cottages, I guess.
Yeah,
that's
another
nice
cottage.
You want to see another one?
Sure.
How about that one? They live well. This is the poor side of the Carnegie family.
The second one didn't come up. There was only just the first one with the white columns.
Oops. Okay, hang on.
That one is the main one. The one, yeah. That one right there was, at least according to the tour, was where they put their guests up.
I have to take a trip. Who else lives on that island? Well, some as you know, some Rockefellers married into the Carnegie family, and they have some houses there too. A lot of the later descendants donated the land to the National Park Service. So, let's talk about the philanthropies. The Colonel already talked about some of them. First one was the Dunfermline Carnegie Library in Scotland. You got the $50,000 donation to the Bellevue Hospital Medical College. Important. One of the things the Rockefellers were notorious for was they funded an awful lot of medical schools. And a buddy of the Carnegie was doing the same. The reason the Rockefellers did it is they wanted to get rid of holistic medicine and create an entire national medical system that relied on petroleum-based pharmaceuticals, because they had a monopoly on the refining of petroleum, and one of the extracts goes into pharmaceuticals. And those were the Rockefellers. So when the Carnegies get involved in medical schools, you got to think they've talked.
So did you come across the fact that Andrew Carnegie was a member of the Pilgrim Society?
I didn't.
He was. And they founded in 1895 the Carnegie Institute for Science, and that is what gave birth to the medical.
Got it. No, that's a good note. It didn't come up. I've got like 4 or 5 different references I'm using. None of them mention the Pilgrim.
Yeah. That's going to be a wild dig.
Yeah, well, that'll be fun. It's interesting. The couple of videos I watched on the Carnegies were all puff pieces. And, of course, they didn't mention the Pilgrim Society stuff. Let's see. All right, let's keep going into some of these philanthropies. He founded over 300 libraries. There's a Carnegie Library in your state, almost guaranteed. In 1900, he gives $2 million for the Carnegie Institute of Technology, which would then go on to become Carnegie Mellon University. Interesting. We're going to take a little side note here on the Mellon family, just real quickly. Frick, Carnegie's business partner, was lifelong friends with Mellon, or one of the Mellons. So that's Andrew Mellon. And he's interesting. The patriarch of the Mellon family, and you've seen the Mellon Bank, Mellon Carnegie. This is a very wealthy family in its own right. Thomas Mellon was a judge, a lawyer, and he's the founder of the Mellon Bank of Pittsburgh. He also was the Secretary of the Treasury from 1921 to 1932. Well, why does that matter? Well, his reputation got destroyed during the Great Wall Street crash of '29. It led us in the Great Depression, and basically he was ridiculed and lived a life in shame because of his failure as a Treasury Secretary. But the family still did okay, because we've got him and his brother, Andrew Mellon and Richard Mellon. Like I said, they formed their school. It became Carnegie Mellon, which is a huge research institute. Made a lot of money.
My nephew went to school there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for robotics.
Yeah, I would imagine that's probably a pretty good school for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. They've got exchanges in some strange places, like some countries in Africa we've discussed. But we're not doing the Mellons today, but I thought I'd give them a mention. They are another interesting family. Okay. 1901, he gives $10 million to establish the Carnegie Trust for Universities of Scotland. He backed Jeanette Thurber's National Conservatory of Music of America. Builds Carnegie Hall, which is still the pinnacle where every performer wants to play someday. Gives $10 million for the Carnegie United Kingdom Trust, which is a big grant-making foundation. And if anybody wants to do the dig on that, look at where that money's gone, I think you'll find it interesting. Now, you remember how the Homestead riots happened?
Right.
And Carnegie got mud all over his reputation.
Right.
He decides to establish a large pension fund for former employees at Homestead. None of his other plans, but that one. A little bit of guilt, yeah?
Yeah, a little bit.
He established a pension system for college professors, which would then become TIAA-CREF.
Ooh,
Yeah,
that's interesting.
here's where it gets really interesting. He told the schools, he told church-related schools that you have to sever your religious connections to get his money, and some did.
Anything to destroy religion.
Apparently. Fun little blurb in the chat from Renee. She says JFK Jr.'s wedding was on Cumberland Island. Nice factoid. I did not know that. What else does he do? Yeah, this guy's got 20 plus years to give away a lot of money. He's a big benefactor to Booker T. Washington. He would help fund the Tuskegee Institute and the National Negro Business League with Booker T. Washington. That was Carnegie money. He creates the Carnegie Hero Fund to recognize heroism among pretty much the Five Eyes countries, with a couple Scandinavian ones thrown in there. This guy really is trying to build a reputation, isn't he?
Yeah.
His legacy, and he's whatever he thinks the public's going to make him look good, he'll give money to. Gives $1.5 million for the erection of the Peace Palace at The Hague, which still stands. And then he establishes the Carnegie Corporation, and it's not a corporation; it is a type of trust, very similar. This is basically the Carnegie Foundation. Very unusual tax structure. Side note, I was looking into a family in England, one of the wealthiest in the world, called the Grosvenors. And the Grosvenor, the youngest Grosvenor, the 7th Earl of, I forget which one it is, 7th Duke of Wellington. That's his title. He's about 24, 25 years old, totally stays out of the limelight, but he inherited over $10 billion. This is where you have Grosvenor Square, some of the best real estate in London. But I looked into their trust, and the way the British think about their trust setup, they pay 6% tax every 10 years on their entire wealth and never have to pay estate taxes like normal people do. So that's basically less 0.6% a year is their tax, while everyone else pays 30 or 40%. So it's a good gig if you can get it.
Well, you have to buy the politicians first. So I don't know if this is the appropriate point to put this in, but do you know who Norman Dodd is?
Can you save the Dodd? Because I want to play some clips of him when we go into foundations. Because Norman Dodd's a legend.
But we have to talk about it right now since we're talking about Carnegie.
Okay, go for it.
Because what's he famous for, Warhamster?
What, Norman Dodd?
Yeah.
The investigation into foundations and his congressional testimony.
Yes, called the Reese Commission, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So here's what he had to say about the Carnegie specifically. We are now at the year 1908, which was the year that the Carnegie began operations. And in that year, the trustees meeting for the first time raised a specific question, which they discussed throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is there any means known more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? That's the Carnegie Foundation in the first year of existence.
It's an interesting assumption.
Secondly, in 1909, they raised a second question. How do we involve the United States in a war? Finally, they answered the question as follows. We must control the State Department. And that to me is like a mic drop, because what you have done so articulately through all of these secret societies is how did they control the State Department? How many skull and bones ended up in the State Department?
That's the connection. I mean, bing, that is a mic drop.
That's the entire kind of like bow on a ribbon of everything that we did in the Skull and Bones, is they maintained control of the State Department, because in the early 1900s, the Carnegie Peace Organization is trying to figure out how we consistently get the United States into a war. And you do that by controlling the State Department.
Now, you've just segued exactly into the next segment here, so that was fantastic. We did not coordinate that, people. All right, so he establishes the Carnegie Corporation, current market value of $1.55 billion. And one of the things this thing does is creates the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And we're going to spend the next half an hour or so going over that, because it's popped up in the Colonel's homework and my research as well. Carnegie publicly states, remember what the Colonel just said about the Carnegie Foundation that Norman Dodd just talked about. Carnegie says, I believe that war could be eliminated by stronger international laws and organizations.
I.e. the UN, NATO, and all of that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right. He also wants to hasten the abolition of international war, which he called the foulest blot upon our civilization. Yet he establishes the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace 2 years before World War I breaks out, and we've had war ever since. So how successful has he become?
Well, and you also have, according to Norman Dodd, documentation that they wrote to President Wilson in a telegram cautioning him to make sure the war doesn't end too soon.
It's also worth notable, he didn't support McKinley. But when McKinley died, he became best friends with Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, he's the one who...
And what did Teddy Roosevelt do?
Yeah, quite a bit. Progressive president. It's interesting that Carnegie is the one who financed Roosevelt's famous trip to Africa. So,
that's the Spanish-American War, the acquisition of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. So now you know why he didn't support McKinley.
Yeah, this guy's got so full of contradictions. It's amazing. It says one thing and does the opposite. But I
think that's fairly consistent.
Yeah, but the history, if you're taught in school what a benevolent robber baron he was.
Dictator is probably a better word.
What else do we have? Oh, yeah, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace is considered the third most influential think tank in the world. But let's take a look at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, shall we?
Sure.
All right. We'll just go to their website, see what they say about themselves in their own words.
Oh, and let me just add while you're bringing that up, Carnegie also said that after World War I concludes, they put out basically the propaganda that the only way to prevent future wars was to control the education of the United States.
I think that's been executed.
Yep.
All right, let's take a look at this Carnegie Endowment for International War. What's the headline? Trump's plan to push FEMA's role to the states will be a fiscal disaster. So we know what their politics are. Talk about Iran after the battle. President Lee Jae-myung in Korea.
Well, you can't control it if you push it to 50 separate entities.
This is true. We deliver unbiased research to decision makers who help set the global policy agenda. Sounds pretty globalist to me. What else we got here? We generate action policy to ideas to help forge a safer world. Ending new wars of attrition. So these guys talk about ending war nonstop, but these are the same think tanks that are in the ear of the people that start all the wars.
As we just said, what they do behind closed doors is instigate wars. What they do outside those doors is pretend like they're for peace.
Let's take the research tab. What do they do research in? Foreign Fighters 2.0. The interplay of technology and the lived experience in the Russia-Ukraine war. Interesting.
Lived experience.
Digital democracy. This is just Globalist 101. Let's real quick look at the current board of directors before we look at the former ones.
I can't wait till we get to the former ones.
Yeah, that's all the mic drops. Let's stop me if you see. Oh, Steve Denning, we know. I see any name? Bill Bradley, Rhodes Scholar, unless that's a different Bill Bradley.
I doubt it.
Current president.
I don't think Allen and Company is intimately involved in the CIA.
Are they?
Yes.
That wouldn't be a shocker, especially when we see the rest of the roster. Mariano Florentino Cuellar is now the current president. I don't really see any names jumping off the page at me. Here's an Oppenheimer from Oppenheimer Partners. A lot of these people are going to be spouses of famous people or business interests. A lot of them international.
Ratan Tata?
Where that name came up? Did I skip over that? Where is that?
Because he...
yeah. We'll get to that when we do the list, yeah.
Yeah, he's a board of trustee.
Yep. I've got that on the other list. So let's start going through the history of since this Foundation for International War was created. I did a thread on X with most of this last week because when it's Carnegie's came up in a conversation. But the first we first mentioned the Carnegie Endowment when we find that the Russell Trust Association's founding treasurer, Skull and Bones alumni, Daniel Gilman, was one of the original presidents of the Carnegie Institution. Why do we know the Russell Trust Association? Because Russell, former opium smuggling family, was one of the co-founders of Skull and Bones in 1834. The Russell Trust, created 15 years later, is how they financed Skull and Bones. And their treasurer is one of the first presidents of the Carnegie Institution. So from day one, this institute is tied to Skull and Bones. Gilman would go on to serve on the John D. Rockefeller General Education Board and has been president of both UC Berkeley and Johns Hopkins. What did you just say about education?
They love controlling education because that's how they brainwash everyone.
Okay, next person that we run into the Carnegie Endowment is when we look at someone named Harvey Hollister Bundy, Skull and Bones class of 1909, part of the prominent Bundy clan. who have numerous bonesmen throughout the years. Why did we talk about Harvey Hollister Bundy before? He was the special assistant to Skull and Bones alumni Henry Stimson, and helped implement the Marshall Plan. You've talked about Stimson ad nauseum. So, and Stimson's a war pig. So there you have it. That's Carnegie Endowment for War.
Exactly.
Yeah. Harvey Hollister Bundy would actually go on to succeed as the chairman of the Carnegie Endowment, a gentleman by the name of John Foster Dulles. Secretary of State. Brother is the founder of the CIA. Any connections yet?
Woven through the entire organization.
Mm-hmm. So I said at the beginning, we don't have a whole lot of Carnegies in Skull and Bones, but boy, there are connections, and that's what we're doing right now. Got another connection. William P. Bundy, same family, Skull and Bones, class of 1939. We've talked about him because he married the daughter of former Secretary of State Dean Acheson.
And did you include Elijah Root?
I did not mention him here. To jump in with anything I missed, because I've only got about 5 or 6.
Well, he was a Secretary of State.
Yeah.
So again, I just read to you that they decided to control the United States through the Secretary of State. And the very first person that was in control of the Carnegie Endowment was, however you say his name, Elijah Root.
Elijah Root.
Yeah, and he goes on to be the Secretary of State.
Yeah, we've talked about Root early on in our series, so yeah.
Yes, we did.
All right. So not only did Bundy marry Dean Acheson's daughter, Acheson's all over Operation Gladio and the story of Skull and Bones. His son, David Acheson, of course, was at Scroll and Key, and I think Dean was too. And, of course, that's where David worked for Covington and Burling, which is the law firm that employed, William Bundy, Victoria Newland, John Bolton, Eric Holder, all war pigs.
I don't know about you, but I see a pattern.
Yeah, just a bit. William Bundy's connection to Carnegie was through his connection to Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss, of course, was the guy targeted by Joseph McCarthy as a suspected communist. And Alger Hiss had also previously served as the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International War. Let that one hang out there a little bit.
That's crazy.
Yeah. What else do we get? When we talked about the Nazi funding of Brown Brothers Harriman, yeah, that's the same bank where, of course, Bonesman Prescott Bush worked, and the Bonesman, the Harrimans, are all over the roster. Brown Brothers Harriman's biggest clients were the Rockefeller and Ford families, Harvard, Yale, and the Carnegie Foundation.
That's crazy.
Just leave that one hanging out there. Small little club, isn't it? Of course, not long ago, we talked about Winston Lord of the venerable Lord family. Winston, of course, was a Bonesman class of 1959. Winston's a guy who studied at Tufts after he left Yale. And, of course, Tufts is the one that's got the exchange program with the Israeli Defense Force and has for decades. Why is Winston so important? Well, he was on the secret trip by Kissinger to China that opened up China in 1971, and he sat in on every single meeting with Mao Zedong and his successors. And, of course, Winston Lord goes on to be the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, the chairman of the National Endowment of Democracy, before becoming chair of the Carnegie Endowment National Commission on America and the New World. Any connections?
That one should be called the New World Order.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to go read some of their writings. What did the National Commission of America and New World write about? I bet we can guess.
Yeah.
All right, another connection, someone we've talked about before. William H. Donaldson, Skull and Bones, class of 1953. He starts his banking career at G.H. Walker and Company, which, of course, is funded by George Herbert Walker, the namesake of George Herbert Walker Bush, who was a bonesman. Donaldson would later co-fund junk bond firm Donaldson, Lufkin, Jenrette, which we've covered. This is one of the pioneers in ESG funds, environmental, social, governmental investing. Yeah, that's Donaldson.
And
All part of it.
he was also the special advisor to Nelson Rockefeller while he was occupying the BP.
Yeah, he's tight with the Rockefellers.
Yeah.
And of course, he becomes the chairman of the Carnegie Endowment for International War from 1999 to 2003. So pretty modern.
Oh, what were we doing during that time? 9/11, anybody?
Yeah, international war.
Yeah.
There's also a guy by the name of we've run into named William M. Alexander. We found him because he's an alumni of the Phillips Academy at Andover, grooming school for bonesmen. Alexander's interesting because his father was a William DeWitt Alexander, Skull and Bones, class of 1855. This William M. Alexander would go on to serve on the board of trustees for the Carnegie Endowment, as well as sitting on the board of Stanford University. What do we know Stanford for?
The Stanford Research Institute that was involved in MK Ultra and everything else.
Yeah. And of course, we can't finish these connections without bringing up the Brookings Institute, which was founded by Robert S. Brookings with money from the Carnegie Corporation. Brookings Institute would go on to help implement the Marshall Plan, map out the creation of the United Nations, created the Congressional Budget Office, among other endeavors.
So instead of giving birth to a son, he laid all of these eggs that hatched.
It's a great way of putting it. All right, you remember we talked about Bill Clinton ally and Rhodes Scholar Strobe Talbot?
Yeah.
Well, he became president of the Brookings Institute in 2002, which is interesting because Brookings are connected to the Carnegies now. Then, of course, there are the notorious war pigs, Robert Kagan, Skull and Bones, class of 1990, who's the husband of war pig Victoria Nuland, who we mentioned earlier today. Funny how that comes full circle.
Yeah.
He served throughout the Foreign Policy Bureau, this is Kagan, before co-founding with Never Trumper PNAC, the Project for the New American Century. And then, of course, Kagan becomes a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment from 1998 to 2010. That's all I have on the Carnegie Endowment, and if you have more, throw it at us.
Let me get back here. I don't know why I'm not seeing. Do you see me on the screen?
I don't.
Yeah, I don't know why. My camera sometimes just goes crazy. But anyway, let me get back to...
Try to turn your camera on and off real quick.
It doesn't do that.
You know, I'm in the icon down at the bottom. There you go. I see a blank screen. I see a blank screen where you should be.
Yeah, that's all I see.
Well, we're close to the end. Do you think we can just finish it up with?
Oh yeah, no, I don't care if anybody sees me or not. I wanted to go back to a couple of points of the endowment. Part of this was they coordinated a group of historians that becomes basically the American Historical Association. And you mentioned repeatedly throughout this entire show about how all of the Carnegie fluff pieces, where they basically in the 1920s issued a grant to the American Historical Association that began with $400,000. Now, $400,000 in 1920 was a crap ton of money. And that has everything to do with why they've been able to control history in America.
Which is a theme that we've hit on over and over again.
Correct.
Did I send you that little meme where basically says, it's funny that if you look back at history, the winners of every single battle and war We're always the good guys. What are the chances? And
So, yeah, exactly. Also, throughout this endeavor, the bridge from the Carnegie Foundation to Britain, and their roots being in Scotland, is very, very important to the whole thing. And that's where the Pilgrim Society comes in, because it provides the overarching bridge, and these people were fundamental in its creation.
yeah, very much so. I mean, it just ties into everything we've said this, over and over again. And it leads through the Carnegies. I mean, the Carnegies are there. All along, I was asking about H.W. Bush being in China in 1971. I think H.W. Bush got there 2 years later as the gatekeeper to businesses, but he was there in the 1970s. Any business that wanted to do business in China had to go through Bush. But yeah, he was not there in 71, I don't think. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I don't think so.
Also got to mention that Andrew Carnegie is a Freemason, member of St. Andrew's Lodge, number 482 in Scotland. I think we're probably going to run into that when we do our several-week session on the Freemasons. Again, I don't always say affiliation with Freemasonry is definitely not always a bad thing, but it's also a place where you hide a real secret society within a secret society. So we'll talk about that more when we get into Masons. Anything else you want to add?
No.
I got one more thing to share.
Okay.
So this is the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, right?
Yes.
What do you think? How do you think they feel about Ukraine?
Well, go ahead and tell us.
Here's a recent article. Europe must lead to prevent the worst in Ukraine. The continent must act urgently to put Kyiv on a path toward a resilient defense that would eventually force Putin to accept a ceasefire. They are pushing for more arming of Ukraine. This is the Institute for Peace. So
go ahead.
This is a bird that hasn't changed its feathers in over a century.
So I did find a CIA document that has been declassified, and why it's classified is very interesting in and of itself, that addressed the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace involvement in the treaties of peace from 1919 to 1923. And in it, it basically starts describing how they're going to parse all of the landmass after World War I. And it talks about defining the borders of France, Italy, Japan, Greece, Romania, the Serb, Croatians, Slovenia state, Turkey. It talks about relationships with Franco-Turkish agreements of 1921. It talks about the League of Nations. It talks about the Iraqi border, the Iranian border. It talks about Syria. So these people were intimately involved in what it evolves into the strategy of tension in redefining international borders to promote war.
Under the guise of philanthropy.
Under the guise of peace.
Yeah, pretty much. If it's getting to the point where whatever they say, just expect the opposite. And obviously, you look at the history we're taught. You'll see in the media these people are just noble characters. These great American titans of business who got rich off the backs of government, funded infrastructure projects, and basically killed competition and owned the regulators, created cartels and monopolies. And then when they made all their money and people are starting to get ticked off because the populist movement's coming, they decide, we'll create these charitable foundations. And boom, no more taxes for us or our beneficiaries. And the rest of you get to foot the bill. Happy 1913, people.
Correct.
And it's no coincidence that World War I breaks out right after the Federal Reserve is created. So,
correct.
So I didn't, like I said, it was interesting that the choice to do Carnegie's this week. It really does tie into everything we've been doing.
And it's the springboard for what we're going to do.
Yeah, I thought so. I thought it was a really nice little bridge there.
I completely agree with you.
We probably want to wrap up Skull and Bones next week, the big summary of everything we've done. Hopefully that can be a 90-minute show or less. I don't know. I'm working on it.
Okay.
That'll be just I think that's just if you can't watch all 30 of our episodes, just watch that one and you'll get the picture. That's what I'd like to do with that. And then after that, before we jump over the Atlantic or get into foundations, I think we need to spend a little bit of time on Scroll and Key.
Okay.
And I've started the research there. That's probably good for, I don't know, 8 to 10 week series because there's a lot there.
And Renee also posted that JFK Jr.'s wedding was on Cumberland Island as well.
Yeah, I said that earlier. I guess.
I thought you said Trump Jr.'s wedding.
No, RFK's. Okay. Yeah, that's a really cool factoid.
Yeah.
It's all connected, and I don't know. I think we connected some more dots today.
I think we did too. Excellent job as usual.
Thanks everyone in the chat.
Yes, very active chat. Awesome people that are part of this discovery with us. And so next week will be, we've said this for like the last 3 shows, but next week is definitely going to be our summary of Skull and Bones. And then as Warhamster just said, we'll move on to the next subject.
Yeah,
so
it's definitely the summary unless something really fun pops up.
Okay. We'll leave that little door cracked open. All right. Thanks for being here, Warhamster.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.